Thank you very much, Hilary. I'm very honoured to have been invited to introduce John McGrath, as I have to admit I have the hugest art crush on him and have had for many years, and I imagine there might be some competition after tonight's talk. John's going to talk for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to have a chance to ask questions for about 20 minutes. And as Hilary said, you can either stick your hand up the old-fashioned way, or if you prefer a more anonymous approach, you can ask your questions via Twitter. So the hashtag, it's hashtag DeaconGFF, for people that want to do it that way. And please do fill in your evaluation forms at the end of the night. I'm going to start with John's biography because it's incredibly impressive, and for those of you that don't know him, it'll give you a little sense of the breadth of his practice. John is the founding artistic director of the National Theatre of Wales, where he has worked with a wide range of artists and partner companies to develop an award-winning mix of work in theatres and site-specific locations across the country. The winning mix of work in theatres, The company has created landmark large-scale productions, The Persians, Coriolanus, The Passion, as well as intimate, imaginative events in spaces as varied as a domestic house, a beach, and a forest, always rooted in local communities and with a strong digital vision. John has also worked as a theatre director in New York, London, Manchester. From 1999 to 2008, he was artistic director of Contact Theatre in Manchester. He trained and worked in New York for several years, including a stint as associate director of the leading experimental company Mabou Mines. As a director, he's worked with a range of artists, including poet Lem Sissay, Storm, Something Dark, and Why I Don't Hate White People, and hip-hop theatre artist Benji Reid, Be Like Water. For the National Theatre of Wales, he's directed A Good Night Out in the Valleys by Alan Harris in 5 Valley Miners Institutes, Love Steals Us from Loneliness by Gary Owen, staged in Bridgend Rock Club. I can hear my Welsh accent coming in, that's what I'm saying. The Radicalisation of Bradley Manning by Tim Price, with every show live-streamed and hyperlinked online, and In Water I'm Weightless by Kate O'Reilly at the Wales Millennium Centre and South Bank Centre as part of the 2012 festival, the finale of the Cultural Olympiad. In 2004, he published a book about art in the surveillance age, Loving Big Brother, Performance, Privacy and Surveillance Space, and in 2005 was awarded the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, the Nesta Cultural Leadership Award. I had the privilege of attending one of the many great events that John has curated and produced as director of Contact, which is a vibrant theatre venue in Manchester, filled with young people from diverse backgrounds who have been enabled by John and his team, because he's great at picking people, to not only take ownership of a venue, but also become hosts and guides for a broader community. Contacting the World was a global cultural exchange program, with teams of young people from many different parts of the world communicating from their home countries, ideas for performances between each other for some months, before travelling to Manchester for the most joyous, exuberant exchange of ideas and art. I remember seeing a post-show Q&A, which I think had maybe 4 or even 5 translators as they navigated their different languages and patiently figured out how to understand each other. John also participated in the Lift Festival when I was director in 2008, and I really recommend festival directing as a way to get closer to your arts crush. He spoke in the Lift New Parliament, which was a portable structure designed by people living in the East End of London that housed performances and film screenings and bands and delicious lunches and great conversations. John hosted a discussion with local people, artists and academics about security, and in an hour had challenged everyone's preconceptions of what surveillance and privacy might actually mean to us as individuals and collectively in a way that was both interactive, informative and transformative, a pretty impressive trifecta. John McGrath is a shining beacon in the global cultural landscape. For me, knowing that he's out there in the world, challenging the ways of doing things, forging connections between artists and others who might not have thought that they had a right or possibility to exercise their imaginations, is a constant inspiration. If, like me, your artistic research or curatorial or programming practice sits outside of or alongside the larger cultural bastions and gatekeepers, connecting with people like John and seeing his work is critical to maintaining focus, courage, and a sense of adventure, and seeing the potential of where we could be, rather than reacting only to what is already here. Now he's the first director of the National Theatre of Wales, and as I'm sure he'll explain, will be doing all sorts of extraordinary projects across the country in different sites, real and virtual. We're very lucky to have him with us to speak today, and the fact that he's Welsh, as I am, and making this extraordinary vision a reality in Wales only makes it better. Welcome, John.
Thank you. I'm not nearly that good, actually. So thank you, Ann-Garrett. Hello, everyone. It's really, really nice to be here, and thanks very much to Hilary, Magda, and Deakin for inviting me. In 2009, myself and a small band of pirates were invited to create a new national theatre here, or here. Or here, or even here. Basically anywhere we wanted, as long as it was in Wales and as long as we didn't build a building. So we were invited to create a new non-venue based, as they called it, National Theatre, which is a very exciting prospect. But there were a few challenges. First of all, it had become a bit of a crowded field for national theatres in the UK. Of course, there was our big building on the south bank of the Thames, the National Theatre of Great Britain, which includes Scotland and Wales alongside England. Also, in Wales itself, at the early 2000s, there had been set up a company called Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, which translates in Welsh as the National Theatre of Wales, for the first time creating large-scale work in the Welsh language, which is, of course, the native language of Wales and the language that is still spoken, thank goodness, by a good quarter of the people. And then in the mid-2000s, National Theatre Scotland had come out blazing. Again, like Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, they were a national theatre that didn't create a building and created work in a wide variety of theatres and all sorts of spaces across Scotland, and coined the brilliant phrase, a theatre without walls. So it was a busy field out there. There were a lot of national theatres to dodge and weave between. Also, there were some particular issues or maybe some questions to face from a Welsh perspective, because Wales has never been a country that's been particularly sympathetic to big centralised institutions. Some of that's to do with the neighbour next door. If you ever try and get around Wales, you'll notice that all the train lines point to London, which isn't that useful when you're trying to get from one end of Wales to the next. Of course, that wasn't a Welsh decision. So centralisation and big organisations are not always that popular. And the third thing was that there weren't actually that many resources. Of course, you save a bit of money by not building a building, but 2009, when we were asked to do it, the credit crunch had really kicked in. We had maybe just under a third of the budget of National Theatre Scotland and about a gazillionth of the budget of National Theatre in London. And so really, we decided with all of these factors, there was only one thing to do if we were going to make the impact that we needed to make, and that was to take a hell of a lot of risks. So we thought about what to do in the first year of our work. We thought about how many risks we could take, and this is what we got up to. So that was our launch year. We called it the Theatre Map of Wales, and it involved one show a month, every month for a year, except we cheated and did 13 instead of 12, all across Wales. And every show was in a different location, and every show responded to that location, the people, the stories, the place. But equally important, every show was made in a completely different way, using a different form of theatre making. So we were both mapping Wales through theatre, but in a way also we were mapping theatre through Wales and asking people, what kind of theatre do you imagine us doing in the future? There were certain characteristics that we drew on that felt really a gift to us in a way from Wales and its communities. The first was that there was a great tradition in Wales of site-specific theatre already. I'm going to go back. There isn't actually a huge tradition of building-based theatre in Wales. There are art centres and there are theatres, but not the big repertory model that you get in England and to a great degree in Scotland as well. But particularly during the 1970s, 80s and into the 90s, there'd been a real embrace of a European tradition around site-specific work, and this had linked into some older traditions in Wales. It's a big festival in Wales each year called the Eisteddfod, which is a big festival of Welsh language and culture that moves around the country each year. So that idea of site, we felt, could really be our friend. The second thing that's a big tradition in Wales is that there is a long history of people getting involved in the arts as participants, as makers. Some of you will have heard some of the great Welsh choirs like the Treorchy Male Voice Choir, ordinary people making beautiful music together. Amateur theatrical societies, amateur musical societies have populated Wales historically. Many of those have become under-resourced over the years, but the tradition was there, the knowledge was there, and we felt we could draw on it. Thirdly, and much more, in a much more contemporary sense, we were creating this theatre in 2009. And 2009 was really the beginning of what people were really starting to call Web 2.0, a point where the internet was no longer just a place where you received information or published a website, but a place where you conversed, made networks, and talked to people in a new and different way, and actually could be creative. So those three things became things that we drew on in creating the Theatre Map of Wales, and that's what created the kind of mix of work that hopefully you just got a glimpse of in the video. Now, I could stay here all night and talk to you about each of the pieces of work, all 13 of them, and the many travails and some of the triumphs that were involved, but I won't do that because it would go on for too long. But I do want to follow up on the idea that each of them was made in a different way, and each of them had a different relationship to its location, to its community. So I'm going to pick 4 or 5 examples to talk about a little bit more. And these are 4 or 5 that were made in ways that are almost at contrast to each other. Probably our best-known piece, and certainly our biggest, was the 13th of the 13. It was called The Passion, and it was a reimagining, but in a very secular way, of the story of Christ's Passion, which is often performed over the Easter weekend. This piece came about because our producer, Lucy Davis, knew from her London days the actor Michael Sheen, who many of you will know from his portrayals in Tony Blair and other characters in Hollywood movies. And Michael's from Port Talbot, where this play was being set. So Port Talbot's a town on the south coast of Wales, and it's much denigrated, actually, in popular culture. It's the home of a big steel works. It's very economically depressed. A lot of the industry has gone away, although the steelworks is still just about functioning. People think it smells funny because of the steelworks and the sulfur. There's all sorts of stories that people tell about Port Talbot. But Port Talbot is actually the center of a great artistic tradition, and particularly some of the greatest actors, certainly that Wales has ever produced. Richard Burton, you might have heard of him, Anthony Hopkins, and now Michael Sheen. So when Lucy went to talk to Michael about being part of our opening year and making work across the country, he said, well, I'll come back to Port Talbot. And she talked to him a little bit more about what his memories were of theatre and of the town. And he said that as an ordinary lad growing up in the town, his first theatre memories were of the passion plays that the local people, local amateurs, would perform in the local park, Margam Park, over the Easter weekend. And was there a way to take those and use them as the basis for something extraordinary? I think even at that point, when he had that first conversation with Lucy, they had no idea of quite how extraordinary it was going to get. Michael ended up working with the fantastic director Bill Mitchell of Wildworks Theatre Company, based in Cornwall, who I invited to come up and work with us on this, and also the poet, Owen Shears, a beautiful Welsh poet. So we got the three of them together, and they imagined a 72-hour-long performance. This is the opening scene of it, the baptism scene that took place on the beach in Potolba, and you can see the steelworks there in the background. I was just telling a little story about this because the next scene after this, or the scene that cued the next bit, took place way across the bay in an old folks' home where there was a dance taking place in the old folks' home. And for one reason and another, the dance took a little bit longer than expected to complete. And these guys couldn't move from this position until the dance in the old folks' home across the bay was finished. You had a few hundred people in the bay at this point watching, so the water came up and up and up. Before they were able to move, the water was at waist height, and I'll show you another picture in a moment. And they stood there, quite extraordinary. So that was the opening scene, and this is the actual baptism moment. And that's Michael, who jumped into the water. You might have seen in the video him getting ducked under by one of the other characters. And I'm bouncing this an awful lot, aren't I? I'm really sorry. Try and move it a little bit. A few hundred people at the start of that, but also Michael and the team and Bill had been working with the local community for a whole year at this point. So they had different people as part of the show at different points in its 72-hour progression. And all in all, over the period of the event, 1,000 local people took part in that show. And one of the great things about having 1,000 local people taking part in the show is everybody in town gets to hear about it. So the show grew and grew. This is the scene that's based on the Last Supper. There's a Last Supper going on inside that building. It's called the Seaside Social Club. But there's a few thousand people outside watching the scene on big video screens as well. I think it's important to say at this point that this wasn't the story of Jesus or of religion. And there are people of all sorts of beliefs and non-beliefs in Potolba. It was a story based on that well-known tale, but was actually the story of a man who has lost his memory and wanders out of the town and then comes back to Potolba and somehow has found a way inside his head to channel all of the stories that have been lost of that town and starts telling them back to the people. And those stories become dangerous. And that's why ultimately he suffers and is, in our story too, put to death. The community performers created, I think, the most extraordinary moments in the whole show. Potolba, amongst its, the many things that has happened to it, it's been bypassed by a motorway. So the M4 motorway that goes from Cardiff to Swansea goes on stilts over the town of Potolba. You can get off if you want to, but its main presence in the town is as a huge bridge over much of the population. And one street in particular, Llewellyn Street, had half of its houses, so the houses down one side of the street, knocked down to create these pillars with a motorway on top, and the other houses on the other side of the street left standing. So this is one of the scenes in the play where Michael's character, the teacher character, comes back to this street, and the inhabitants of the street and people who knew people who used to live in the houses that now are replaced by those motorway pillars reenacted moments from the memories over 10, 20, 30 years. Extraordinary, beautiful scene about people's lives that have been forgotten by developers suddenly coming back to life in the space where those memories happened. Really importantly with that piece, it had a huge digital life. And as well as community performers, we had community bloggers working on the show. And those community bloggers would make videos, write about the show, and post it all on this website here. And what started to happen during the production is the word spread virally, not just word of mouth, but online as well. And people were logging into this site and finding out what was going on. Now, the BBC made a big documentary about this show. It's a fantastic documentary. The filmmaker, Dave McKee, made a beautiful full-length feature film based on footage from the show. A really extraordinary piece of work. But for me, the best record of all of this production is the stuff that those community bloggers produced. So I'm going to show you a really short, really, really rough piece of video that one of those bloggers took and posted on this site, because I think, oh yeah, we're going to see it now, and because I think that gives you a sense of exactly what went on. So this is about halfway through the 72 hours, just in the local shopping centre.
I see you. Who? You. I see you. How can you see me now? Yes. Yes. I see you. You see me? I do, yes.
So that was The Passion for Tolba, which by the end of the show, which was performed, our version of the crucifixion scene, was performed on a traffic roundabout in the town, on the edge of the town. 16,000 people turned up to see that final scene, and many, many tens of thousands more were watching online. People were tweeting the story, sending each other's pictures. It was probably in the UK the first substantial piece of work to be spread, particularly through Twitter, actually. Extraordinary piece of work, but not everything was on that scale, and things were equally important if they weren't on that scale. Another piece of work made in a very different way was a show that we made with the German company Rimini Protocol, who work a lot in what's known as the reality theatre movement, working with real people. But this piece, I would say, had a very different starting point to the community starting point of The Passion. I'd say the starting point for this piece was actually the audience itself. Because Rimini Protocol wanted to explore what it would be to take an audience on a journey, watching a video on an iPod, and take a group of people through a town where they were each tracking their movements through a video that had been made in the same town, but at a different day and by a different person. So if you can imagine it, if I'm explaining it properly, that every audience member had the voice of another person in their ear, a video that that person had made of a journey through the town of Aberystwyth, which was where it was set, and you held the video up in front of you, and you watched the scene that you were walking along through as you went through the town. So you were living in a kind of dual reality. And the community that made that piece with Rimini came in a way were the next stage after that idea about the audience. But they did pick very well. They decided to work with a local choir, just an amateur choir, and the journey through the streets became the journey of the choir members, the members of that choir, to their choir rehearsal every Tuesday evening. So there you see the audience setting off on a journey. People would, on their journey, they would go through, often by themselves, through the town, hearing the stories, often really quite day-to-day comments about, you know, this is where I go and pick up my bread, or I remember dropping off my child at this school. So real introduction into people's day-to-day. And then at the end of the show, all the audience, sometimes you would have seen another audience member across the street, all the audience members would find themselves converging and ending up in one space, and they'd all end up going up a staircase following their videos, and there they'd meet the choir, who would be in the middle of their choir rehearsal. It was slight ramifications of that meant that we could only perform the show on Tuesday evenings when there was actually a choir rehearsal going on. So we actually had to run that show every Tuesday evening for a whole year. And one little background story about that, we did a special little, I guess it was a marketing thing, but it was a little offer to people that if they managed to make it to all 13 shows, we had a little passport that you could get stamped if you turned up to all 13 shows. We'd give them their money back for all the shows that they'd been to. I didn't think anyone would actually do it. Unfortunately, quite a few people did, and it cost us a bit of money. But actually, this show was my great friend, because a whole bunch of people, because this one went on every Tuesday for a year, a whole bunch of people thought, oh, well, I'll do that one later on. And when it came to the last couple of performances, it was all booked out and they couldn't get tickets. So I saved a bit of money on those last few people. We also sometimes worked with really gritty issues as well. And this is an image of a show that we did in another South Wales town, a town called Bridgend. And Bridgend, unfortunately, have become known in the news over recent years as what the media chose to portray as the centre of a teenage suicide cult. Now, what the media had actually done was looked at some fairly dubious statistics and started to invent a story. But stories have a way of replicating themselves, and therefore, within the town, there had started to be a certain amount of truth around this story. Even worse, because that we were in the age of social networking, etc., and the young people involved had often been talking to each other on Facebook, and tributes had appeared on Facebook to young people. The newspapers, in particular, a couple of our more notorious newspapers, one of them owned by a famous Australian, really ran with that story and decided it was the beginning of the Facebook suicide threat. So it was really horrible for people in the town. Journalists descended on the town, started interviewing young people who were very vulnerable. And the town basically went into lockdown. So you can imagine that was a very difficult story for us to think about addressing. And yet at the same time, it seemed the most important bad news story that had happened to Wales in the last few years. And it didn't seem to me that as a national theatre, we could avoid addressing it either. So we worked very closely with a fantastic playwright, Gary Owen, who was brought up in Bridgend, spent his own teenage years there, and had struggled with some of the same issues. And he wrote a play talking a lot with young people, and we workshopped a lot with young people. But with this piece, we made a piece for professional actors about young people, grief and loss, not actually about suicide. Out of the workshops with the professional actors, young people often taught us how to do the show better. They redirected several of the scenes for me, which definitely made it a better play. And they talked to us about the issues and were given the, oh, iTunes has quit unexpectedly. Do you want to bring it back? And taught us to really explore the issues in a way that would be sensitive to their needs. We staged it in a rock club in the middle of Bridgend. There isn't a theatre in Bridgend, but also young people were more likely to go to this venue. And we also created an online project with young people where they could remap the town online. We called it Our Bridgend, where they could make their own markers all over Bridgend and place memories of their lives, dark memories, light memories, happy memories, sad memories. It didn't all have to be good news, but it was theirs, not the media's. With all of our projects, we also had an associated piece of work called The Assembly, where we gather a group of artists, some local, some not local, work together really intensively over 1 or 2 weeks, asking people, what's a local question that you'd like to address through a mixture of performance and debate? Sometimes, as in this case, that question really tied in with the show. Sometimes it was a question we'd not noticed when we were planning to do the show, so it allows us to have a bit of rapid response. With the young people in Bridgend, we had an assembly debate, and we said, well, how would you like to frame this question? And they reframed the question in the most extraordinary way. The subject of this debate was, is love dangerous? And I thought that was a really beautiful way for them to start to think differently about danger in their lives. We had the event in the local bus station, because that's where young people tended to gather, and really was a quite extraordinary evening. Of course, doing site-specific work, sometimes your biggest informant is quite simply the land itself, the site itself. And this was visually, I think, perhaps the most extraordinary piece of work we did in the first year. It's a piece called The Persians, which, of course, is the name of a play by Aeschylus, the Greek writer. In fact, the first play written in the European canon. It's a play about a defeated army. But it wasn't our starting point. The starting point was this village. And this village is in the Brecon Beacons, in the middle of Wales, and it's a village built by the army to practice warfare. So this piece of land, a quite substantial piece of land in the middle of Brecon National Park, was appropriated by the army in the Second World War, quite understandably for training purposes, but rather more controversially was never given back to local people. It was kept by the army. This village was built in the middle of it, but there's a vast swathe of land around it, and used for army maneuvers. It has doubled as a German village in the Cold War, and as you can imagine, at the time we were working there, it was doubling as an Iraqi village, as an Afghani village. So the director, Mike Pearson, had some connection with this land and actually made a really good relationship with the army commander who ran the land. And he said to me, when I invited him to work with us, he said, actually, if we're going to do a theatre map of Wales, we need to map the bit that isn't on the map, that nobody talks about, that when you see it on the, on the big map of Wales, it's just kind of greened over. So let's go to that place. Fortunately, he negotiated with that army commander, and we got access to this village. They suspended their operations there for the time that it took us to do the last period of rehearsals and the show itself. And we created a piece about the eternal question of warfare in a place where warfare was in the middle of happening. And you'll see some of the images as we go through. So in the previous picture, you saw the audience arriving. They were all dressed in green ponchos, which was a purely practical thing initially. We had to buy them something to keep them dry in case it rained. And then when we saw them in them, we decided to make it compulsory for them to wear them because it took them into the visual world of the play so beautifully. So they progressed through that village, and then they followed the actors towards one of the houses where the main action of the play took place. But I think what's really important to say in that place is that this wasn't an interesting way of staging the Persians. The Persians was actually an interesting way to explore this place. That's the final scene as the sun went down over the Brecon Hills. So as the audience took the bus home, it was really quite a moving and chilling moment that would be the point often at which the young soldiers were starting their maneuvers again, and that's what the bus would drive through as we went back to our home site, young people training for war in Afghanistan. Artists also made extraordinary collaborations, and this was a piece of work made by wonderful Welsh artist Mark Rees, who comes from a dance and design background. And there was something in his aesthetic that I felt would really somehow mix well with kind of seaside towns that you find in Wales. And Angharad will know what I mean. There's a particular kind of seaside town where lots of people from the UK go on their holiday and get candy floss. And some of them have turned a little bit on, on harder days than they once were. So I asked Mark to go on a car ride around seaside towns and to visit as many as possible and stay in everything from a posh hotel to a caravan site. And he fell in love in the town of Barmouth. But before he'd gone off on his journey, he'd say, "I'll do anything, John, but don't make me work with the community." I don't do that. I said, "It's all right, you don't have to work with the community. It's completely optional." Then he came back from his journey and he'd fallen in love with his town of Barmouth, and all he could do was tell me the stories he'd been told by the community in Barmouth. So I said, "Whoa, actually sounds like you had some quite good input from the community." He said, "Well, maybe I'll talk to them a bit more about their stories anyway." He ended up virtually living in Barmouth for a year. He set up a story shop for local people who'd come in and tell him their stories. He became the best friend of the local historian. But he also invited his artist friends from Wales and from Europe and from his experimental traditions to make the work with him. So he ended up with a piece, and this is the start of the piece. Sorry, there it is. In the village hall, with the audience gathering. They have tea and cake that's provided by the local Women's Institute, and they go off in groups to walk around the town. And in the town, these stories and memories of local people are being enacted, sometimes involving local people, but also very much involving these extraordinary performance artists who Mark knew. So the young man there is Kai Thomas, who's a wonderful dance theatre artist from North Wales, and he's running across the bridge. And this story was told to us by an old lady called Joni, who had lost her fiancé in the Second World War. And this was her memory of running across the bridge with her fiancé before she lost him to the war. And a local young woman played Joni in that scene. Mark also channeled a particular character himself. This is a guy called Tommy Nuttall, who was a tailor who came from Barmouth, who went on to design suits for Mick Jagger in Savile Row. So we brought Tommy Nuttall back, and Marega Pulser, who's a really wonderfully extraordinary, eccentric performance artist, relived the days when dancing girls had come to the beach to entertain people. But my favourite moment of all in this piece was a piece that Kai did in the local nightclub, which is a typical sticky carpet, smells of beer in the daytime nightclub. And he did this wonderful, manic, quite experimental dance, flinging himself all over the nightclub as we watched. And then towards the end, the music, which had been this banging techno music, quietened down. An old lady came to the middle of the floor and started dancing with Kai. And of course, that old lady was Joni, who told us the story of losing the fiancé that Kai was playing. So those are some of the pieces that we made and some of the different ways that we made them during that year. But we were also very keen to make sure that all the bits joined up. And one of the ways that we did that, and I mentioned this at the beginning, was through social networking. So before we'd done any of the shows and before we decided what any of them were, we created this, which is a National Theatre Wales social network, where anybody could join, post blogs, talk with us. All the staff are spending time on there. And one of the very first things we said is, we're thinking of creating this theatre map of Wales. Where should we do it? What should be in it? Who should be part of it? And because it was a genuine question, because it was an open question, because actually we still didn't know what we were going to do, people started responding and having conversations and sending us photos of extraordinary sites. And all of those shows ended up having groups on the site where people would post all sorts of blogs, etc., as the work developed. And you can go to any of those shows and see the background work through those groups. But the other important thing that started to happen is that artists in Wales, including quite emerging artists, started to post their own work on the site. So it didn't become just the National Theatre Wales site, it became a community for theatre makers in Wales where people could look for people to make work with, they could have a bit of a moan with me, at me if they wanted to. So there's a writers group on there where there's a really lively, it's my favourite group actually, it's a really lively group of writers, but boy don't they stick it to me if they think I'm not commissioning enough new plays. So it's a lively space, and in some way that's become our theatre foyer, our cafe, and we spend a lot of time there and continue to. And we found the more we open it up, the better it gets. So you'll see there in that screenshot that I've taken, it's from a few months ago actually, that screenshot, but there's loads of events that people are advertising. None of those are our events, they're all events that other people in Wales are putting on. Why not have them on our site? It enriches the conversation. The assembly, of course, was an important part of that as well. As I mentioned, the assembly that we did in Bridgend. We also had an assembly in Barmouth with Mark's show. We had one everywhere we went. This is a picture of an assembly that we did in a place called Butetown in the Old Bay area of Cardiff, where we very much used the assembly to ask people a question about what our show should be. The Bay area is by far the most multicultural area of Wales. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more of a story about that piece a little bit later on. National Theatre Wales team, which this video is about, that's the single most important way during all of this.
Team members are at the centre of everything we do at National Theatre Wales. They're a network of people who we collaborate with and support to run their own projects. Team is really our way of having an ongoing conversation with the people of Wales.
Well, I got involved in Team when National Theatre of Wales came up to my local theatre, and it was their first show called The Good Night Out in the Valleys. So I got involved with that, and then I moved on to the first assembly project.
I got an email through just saying that there was a poetry night, and I thought, I've written one poem, I'll give it a go. Devinda invited me into National Theatre Wales for a bit of a chat and to see where I wanted to go with it.
I was lucky enough to be part of the Provincial Life Ensemble, which was an opportunity I got from being part of Team. It was a really great opportunity because I was able to work with one of the leading directors of Chekhov, which was Peter Gill.
I set up an event called Stories of the Streets. It's a new writing event with the help of Devinda and Anna. Leadership training, we did that, and that was really useful.
I had the opportunity this last summer to go to a Pollinate summer camp with Wales Lab.
It's great to meet this network of people from all over Wales.
I was doing an event. At one point we thought the show wasn't going to go on, and then my team leader got in touch with Yusuf, and he's part of the team. They got involved, and then we just got really happy and thought, oh, maybe we can finish the show. And we did, and it was great.
I have a module in university which is called work-based learning, where you go into the professional field and worked for a while, and I did this with National Theatre Wales. It was very beneficial because it helped to understand their structure and the processes.
Team Panel is a group of 11 team members from across Wales who feed into the overall development of National Theatre Wales. You'd think like with a big company like National Theatre Wales that they wouldn't really want to listen to your ideas and how you think the company could help you and things like that. But with Team Panel it gives us kind of a voice.
You should get involved in team because there are so many different opportunities available to you. You can perform, you can write, you can take photographs, film, you can start up your own event, take advantage of the training opportunities that will always be posted up on the National Theatre Wales team group. Get involved backstage, you can get involved on stage, you can be involved in the office. All we need is for you to tell us what you want to do.
So team along with the digital is how it all joins up, and anybody can be part of that. And what we try and do in particular is invest in people's leadership training and their own projects. So when we move on from these locations with our big show, there's an investment of time and expertise to support people in continuing to do their own thing. So that was our first year. And I think at the end of it, we'd managed to establish 2 or 3 really important things. One, we'd managed to establish a network that was across Wales where people were in touch with each other. It wasn't just a series of isolated shows. I think equally importantly, we've managed to establish a spectrum. And that spectrum, I think, is really important to some of the questions, Hilary, that you'll think about at Arts Participation Incubator. Because there wasn't a set of community work at one end and a set of professional work at the other. There was a whole range of work in which community members and professionals were getting involved in different ways, at different points, in different kinds of collaboration. And all of that work was in our main programme. And thirdly, and these things are important, we'd established a critical reputation. So we were able, for the first time really in Wales, to bring all of the big critics from London, from elsewhere, into Wales to start looking at this work. And occasionally they didn't like it, but most of the time they really did. And that was great, and that was important. And again, that was saying that work that can be deeply participatory can also be seen as excellent by some of the toughest theatre critics out there. So at the end of the first year, that's where I think we got to. But we were most interested really in what we hadn't done yet. We wanted to ask people what was missing, what could we have done that we didn't manage to do, or what are you inspired by what we have done to ask us next time. So if the first year was all about taking risk, we wanted to keep the risk going in the second and third year. But some of the responses we got, particularly related to the second half of the title to our talk today, Making Theatre in the Age of Google, Occupy, the Arab Spring. Because a number of the responses we got were about the shifts that were happening in politics and the shifts that were happening in how people wanted decisions to be made. And you remember that writers group that sometimes give me a hard time? Well, one of the very active people on that writers group is a young playwright called Tim Price, who had loads of opinions about what National Theatre Wales should and shouldn't be doing. So I got him in for a talk and said, okay, you tell me what was missing in that first year. You know, we did a lot. Come on, Tim, give me a break. And he said, I'll tell you what was missing. What was missing was an overtly political piece of theatre. He said, you know, we're in a moment where we have to be able to speak about politics. And although the work had a politics underpinning it and had a social politics to it, where's the piece that actually nailed some political colours to the mast? So, of course, I said to him, okay, go away and write that play, and we'll put it on. So he came back to me with a piece called The Radicalisation of Bradley Manning. And Bradley Manning, many of you will know, is the young soldier who is accused of and recently at least partially admitted to being responsible for the leaking of the Iraq-Afghan embassy cables to WikiLeaks. At the time that Tim came to us about doing that show, Bradley Manning was being held in solitary confinement. A large part of the day he was being kept naked or semi-clothed by the American military as a kind of, I think it would be fair to say, pre-judgment punishment for what he'd done. And he was up in front of a potential death penalty. Bradley Manning has a Welsh mother and spent his teenage years in West Wales going to schools that were quite local to us. So we had a particular purchase on this story, and the UK government has been very unwilling to acknowledge any link to him. So we worked with Tim to create a piece about the Bradley Manning story. And one of the things that we did was that we cast a cast of young actors, all pretty much Bradley Manning's age. So although they were playing characters, there were 6 actors in the play, playing about 30 characters of every age that you can imagine, but everyone on stage was his age, which really brought home the power of the story that we were dealing with. And the other thing we did, given our tendency to bop around Wales, is we asked his old school whether we could make and premiere the piece there. So these young actors spent much of the rehearsal time in the school hall where Bradley had gone to school assemblies just a very small number of years ago, around some of the kids who were going there now, and that's where we performed the piece, not just for school kids, for a general audience, but in that school environment. But equally importantly, we felt that this was online story as well as a theatre story. So whenever we made it on stage, we also live cast it on the web. So whenever that play happens, it also happens online. Not in some glossy Metropolitan Opera National Theatre at the cinema way, beautiful though that work can be, but through surveillance cameras that we hid in the set, in quite a rough kind of way, and not on a big picture, but embedded in a page like this, where people were also encouraged to chat with each other, talk about the issues, and also to follow a whole series of links to the background story. So you weren't having a sort of faux theatre experience online. You were having what we called a hyper-connected experience, where you could link out, you could watch or not watch the show, but what we really wanted you to do was participate in the story and ask some political questions. I'm going to show a little clip of video about that.
National Theatre Wales's dress rehearsal for the radicalisation of Bradley Manning allowed cast and crew to have a full run-through with props, costumes, lighting and sound design. It also offered them an opportunity to test out the 4 CCTV cameras that were being used for an ambitious live webcast that NTW delivered through their website.
Some scenes, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, actually watching them through those cameras, they're actually more powerful perhaps than they can ever be on stage, because they're scenes that kick in as scenes that we're used to seeing through that quality of camera, whether that's surveillance or a phone camera or whatever it's been.
We're creating a different aesthetic and a different experience of the show. So there's a really strong feeling of surveillance in the video feed. You're almost monitoring the story as it unfolds, and that has quite an interesting effect on the way you feel about what you're watching, because you're kind of spying on it.
Who authorized this?
We're wasting our time on them, sir. They're not.
Who authorized this translation?
Well, I did, sir. Thought, I had suspicions that these weren't. They didn't look like insurgents, sir. I think by doing this, I've saved resources so we don't spend time gathering
Your
intel
role
on these 50 when
is to
they're just
support
regular.
our brigades on the ground by identifying and tracking insurgents.
Yes, sir.
How does this help support our brigades?
I've no idea who the weird guy with the beard is in that, so I apologise for him. So we were asking people what was missing, and sometimes what was missing was part of the story that we'd already told. So this is a picture from a project that we did called the Soul Exchange, which took place in that Cardiff Bay area. I showed you an image of the assembly earlier on in that same area, where we were asking questions about what show this should be, what kind of a show we should do there. I felt it was crucial that we represented the multicultural communities of Wales in our launch year, and therefore that we did work there. And the initial answer that we got was that because that Bay Area had been home to so many different communities, we should create a piece that told the history of those many communities. And that's what we did. We created a piece that started off with an audience taxi ride through the streets of Bute Town, because many Cardiff dwellers who aren't from Bute Town will only ever pass through it in the taxis that are driven by local people from Bute Town, where the life of the street was seen as you went by in the cab. But eventually all those cabs gathered in a building called the Coal Exchange, which is where the coal from Wales used to be traded. It used to be the centre of one of the richest trades in the world. Of course, is now fallen into disrepair and often isn't even open to local people. So we took that over and turned it into what we called the Soul Exchange for the night. But after we'd done that show, a group of young men who'd been involved in the show came virtually the day after it had finished, came to meet me and Devinder, who you saw working on Team up there in the office. And they said, we really enjoyed being in the show. It was great to play the roles that we got to play, but you didn't really tell our story. We're young Somali guys living in Cardiff today. The Somali population in Cardiff, in Cardiff Bay, has existed for over 100 years, but has grown a lot recently. And those young men tend to get demonized, and often they're seen as the cause of trouble. And yet they said, we're rappers, we write poetry. And they had a beautiful phrase for what they felt their situation was. They said, the world sees us as pirates, and we see ourselves as poets. And they said, that's the story that you should be telling, John. That should be National Theatre Wales's next piece. So in our next year of work, that's one of the pieces that we made. It started with, again, a parade through the streets, but outside the cabs this time. It landed in the Welsh Parliament building, which is in Cardiff Bay, where a lot of the population was displaced from to create these big new buildings, where the young poets had a parliament of poetry, and it ended up with us sending a huge poet warrior out into the bay, sail out to the world to spread our message that young Somali people are poets, not pirates. Was also very interested in that year in different articulations of space. So Mike Pearson, who'd been a big inspiration for me as a site-specific director in putting the whole program together and have created the Persians for us, worked with his collaborator Mike Brooks to think about a piece that wasn't site-specific but almost created its own site. And I was really keen for him to work with a classic text again, having done so well with the Persians. So I asked him whether he'd do Shakespeare. We hadn't done Shakespeare. We were probably the only theatre company in the whole of the UK to not have done Shakespeare. And so I wanted to do it in a way that was very special to us. Mike, again, I think responding to this age of Occupy and the Arab Spring, felt that the text that could really speak to us was Coriolanus. And he worked with Mike Brooks to create a version of Coriolanus that took place simultaneously live, on video, and on an audio track that was piped into people's ears. So it wasn't a community project in terms of the community get involved in making it, but for the audience it was a completely immersive piece where throughout that piece you had to make decisions about where and how you moved in the show. And these are a few more images of that show. The site, the hangar, was a very beautiful site, but it was just a place to put the kind of what Mike and Mike called the theatre machine that they'd made. And there's the audience on the headphones. And you could have, you could live that experience however you wanted. You could stay still, and sometimes the action would come to you. You could chase it around the space. But my favourite comment about it was from a very young man. We didn't expect anybody under teenage to come see it, but we ended up with quite a lot of 8-year-olds and 7-year-olds there. One of the 8-year-olds was explaining, had come back for the second time, and was explaining to his 8-year-old friend where I should go, and he said, it's Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare like it's James Bond. Sometimes it's also just about communities that you've missed out. So the writer of The Persians, who'd done the new adaptation for us, a fantastic writer, Kate O'Reilly, who has always been very active in disability art. She has a visual impairment herself. So she said, what about that community? It's not a local community, it's a community of interest. Why can't we work with disabled people to make a new piece of work? So this was a piece in Water I'm Weightless that we made with Kate. That was an extraordinary mix of texts, some of them very poetic, some of them angry, some of them very lyrical, that reflected and responded to disabled people's lives in the UK. And that's the piece that we were able to take to London as part of the Olympic ceremony. And we also went outside of the country. So we made a show in Japan, in Japanese. They commissioned one of our writers, Alan Harris, who'd written actually our very first play, to write a piece that responded to, again, wasn't about, but responded to the situation in Fukushima. And he made a piece about a pharmaceutical company and efficiency expert. They wanted us to make it in the theatre space, so we did, but we tried to make the theatre space the kind of surrounding 360-degree video experience, so the audience was set all around the action in this. And for us, again, really exciting and very, very challenging to be making a work. I directed the show in Japanese. I don't speak a word of Japanese. I had a very heroic translator, but a great challenge to us about how do we make our work there. And very importantly with that, we did an assembly in Tokyo, which started to ask the same questions about efficiency and energy that circulated around the Fukushima issue. And we had an incredibly energetic and active conversation. Lots of people said to us, oh, a lot of Japanese people said to us, oh, Japanese people are very polite, they won't really want to get involved in a big discussion and argument at the assembly. The assembly was really intense, people full of opinions and ideas. And of course, to make sure that it was also shared in Wales and elsewhere, we used our online networks. This is the Storify version of it, but it was on our Ning as well and being circulated through Twitter. And one little note at the end of that, in answering all of these new challenges, etc., we never want to forget to have fun. So we also commissioned the fantastic physical theatre company, Frantic Assembly, who work all over Europe, but were actually born in Swansea. They were 2 students at Swansea University, did a physical theatre workshop with the Volcano Theatre Company, who are from Swansea, decided to set up their own company, and moved on from Swansea to London eventually, and went on to become one of the UK's leading companies. They'd never worked in Swansea since they were first there as students. We invited them back, and of course what kicked in was their nostalgia for their crazy clubbing days. So they made a piece in a nightclub about clubbing with a bunch of professional and non-professional young people, and it was just really, really great fun, as you can see. Going forward, and as we start to think about the future, what are the things that we're continuing to look at? We're looking still more at how can people get involved in the decisions that we make. So each year now we've started having all of our team members come together in a big get-together where they look at the programme, propose ideas, just talk about the company and what it could be doing. And we also have a team panel that's almost like a board of team members, and we're starting to look at team panel getting elected onto the board of the organisation as well, so that crossover really completes. We're also looking at the online world and how we continue to push the online world and find new and different ways of exploring how real world and online can interact. So in our second year, we took the assembly in a wholly new direction, where we asked people whose locations we hadn't visited yet, whether they wanted the assembly to happen with them, and anybody could propose an assembly. So every couple of months, the proposal for the assembly would be put online. People could say, this is a really urgent issue where we live, we'd like to have a theatre debate about it, and they put their proposals, put videos about the proposal, and anybody could vote. And we had thousands of people voting for which assembly we should go and do. It was really quite intense for us because we never knew until a couple of weeks beforehand where we were going to be making this piece of work. It could have been anywhere in Wales, and our team would have to gather, we'd recruit local people, but we had some fantastic assemblies through that, what we called the democratically elected assembly. And we also looked at things that were missing in terms of the infrastructure with artists. So this is a project from a big program that we do now called Wales Lab, which is a series of labs for emerging artists and for new ideas in theatre. The sort of thing that you might do with residencies, maybe in the studio theatre if you had a big building. We don't have a building and we don't have a studio theatre. So we've been placing our emerging artists all across the landscape of Wales and asking them to be inspired by the places where they get to explore their ideas and their work. And as you can see, sometimes they get to work in some pretty inspiring locations. So finally, though, I think the thing for us to not forget is to keep taking risks. And this is a project that's back in rehearsal at the moment that we did initially last year. I think one of the riskiest projects that we did and one of the ones that came closest to going very, very wrong indeed. It was a piece we made with Argentina dance theatre maker, Constanza Macras, who's based in Berlin, who's only ever worked in theatres, and now she works in some of the biggest theatres in Berlin, like the Schaubühne and the Volksbühne. But I've been a big fan of her work for quite a while. Managed to entice her over, and we took her to some of our shows and went on lots of walks with her. And she said, oh, I'd love to come and make her work, as long as I can make it in a forest. And she described a forest that she wanted to work in, and it was based on a particular forest that we visited, but we couldn't get access to that forest. So we spent months looking all over Wales for this magical forest that Constanza had described, and we eventually found somewhere. I think we thought we knew how to do site-specific work, but as our production manager said as we were making the work and sometimes tearing our hair out, it's amazing how few plug sockets there are in a forest. The weather wasn't our friend. The forest that we found was in quite an isolated area in the north of Wales. There was a little town nearby where people used the forest to walk their dogs or ride their BMX bikes. But initially, it was really hard to get people involved in the project. Everything really was very challenging and started to go wrong in all sorts of ways. Constanza had a great idea, though. She wanted to use ancient Welsh stories, the fairy stories of Mabinogion, but she wanted to combine them with the stories of contemporary transformation, the stories that you see on the high street in Cardiff where people get drunk at hen and stag parties and dress up in fancy dress. The Mabinogion stories are all about transformation, about people being transformed into animals. So she wanted to bring the contemporary side of that as well. And then she also wanted the grittier stories of how people's lives have been transformed by the economic crisis. So she mashed those three things together, threw them into a forest. We got terribly confused and in some ways quite concerned about the project, but we kept on going, and we decided, since it involved these stories from Cardiff High Street, we better make sure that it happened on Cardiff High Street as well as in a remote North Wales forest. So this is live transmission that we created of a version of the show onto Cardiff High Street, where there's a whole bunch of drunken people dressed in fancy dress outfits having a crazy time, and suddenly a forest appears in front of them with a bunch more crazy people. And it was fantastic. It was fantastic. And the audience that had first seemed bemused by it turned up in their droves. Every ticket was sold out. All those people who'd been walking their dogs and seeing those crazy artists jumping around trees came back because they wanted to know what happened. They had a great time. They told their friends. I think if we tried to outreach experimental Berlin-based performance dance theatre to that community, we might have had trouble with the take-up. But by creating something beautiful and extraordinary in a local people's park and really taking a risk on it and trusting actually that if it was great work, people would come and see it, we got something really beautiful. And this is the final scene of that show, which I think emblematizes the sense of peace and relief that we all had when it actually worked. So that show opened and we thought would only ever see the light of day up in the forests of Flintshire. But Constanza now, having gone through all of this trauma with us, had become a convert to site-specific work. So really wants to recreate this piece. So this summer, right now, she's in rehearsal in Berlin, making a new version of this piece that we made in Flintshire, in the middle of nowhere in North Wales, for a Berlin audience, but in a forest, taking the same sort of risks again, tearing her hair out all over again. Happily this time, I only have to show up for the opening night, so I get this bit. But I like to think that maybe even in that ultimately edgy city of Berlin, where everything's an experiment and everything's different, somehow by taking some extra risks in Wales with our work, we've managed to encourage them to take one extra risk this summer and do something that even in Berlin might not have happened without Wales. Thank you.
Yeah, that was astounding. That was fantastic. It looks like heaven, doesn't it, Wales? Don't you reckon? I don't know whether anyone's been tweeting, but if there are questions in the audience, let's maybe put your hand up and we can have a few. It is perfection, so it's hard, isn't it, to find a crack in it.
I'm really happy for people to ask, practical questions or difficult questions or, yeah. Sorry.
You glossed over, you talked about we, but I wasn't sure who they were. Mm-hmm. And you kind of glossed over that you had a team and a board and things like that. But I'd be interested in getting, is we just you and God? Or?
Did everyone hear that question?
So who was involved?
Who was involved? Who the we is when John talks about we?
So the staff team now, it started off with 5 of us in the back of a coffee shop with mobile phones, but then we went on a search for offices. There was always a board in place. So the government in Wales had decided as part of its increasing independence that it wanted this company to happen. It set aside, a small but perfectly formed pile of money and asked the Arts Council of Wales to help create a board for the theatre. fortunately pulled together a board that really had a vision about wanting to nurture theatre in Wales as well as create exciting work. And then they asked me, and in turn I appointed a merry band of people to come on the journey with me. At this point we're 16 people, which, as one person remarked to me, is around about the same number of people as work in the bookshop or the cafe at the National Theatre in London, so it's not very big. But in that first year, we employed about 650 people on different forms of freelance contracts. So that might just be an actor for a couple of months, or a project manager who worked on a particular project or production with us. And one of our big questions and challenges always actually is that we want to give a sense of family and of community to that range of people who come with us on this journey in a freelance way and make this work happen, rather than just focusing on those core 16 people. So the we can be quite expansive according to who's involved in the project, but ideally I'd like to think of it as the network of people who've made all of this happen.
Question up the back there. Did everyone hear that question? The scale of year one and what the lead-up time was for that?
I started at the beginning of March 2009. People came on over the next couple of months, and the first show opened... I started at the beginning of February 2009, and the first show opened in the beginning of March 2010.
Stuart.
That was brilliant. What scares you?
The weather.
Oh.
You know, there's some of these shows where, you know, I've woken up in the morning in a sweat to look out the window and check the weather forecast. And, you know, I've talked this morning about Mike, the artist who did the Persians, who came up with the most brilliant line where he said, when I said, what about the weather with the Persians, that piece in the army range, because it got nasty sometimes up that army range. He said, I'm making a piece that looks best in the rain. And he actually did, and that was fantastic. It's not always easy to do that. With the Branches piece, the weather was a real challenge. So those practical things scare me. The fact that, you know, actually there's lots that we don't know. So, you know, managing budgets and making sure that it comes in right is a perpetual challenge, and the juggle of that. There are things that are concerns to me, but not fears. The biggest concern is to make sure that we fulfill our commitment to people, actually. That if we are going in with a piece of work, that the follow-up is real, that people genuinely feel invited to talk to us about what could come next. And that's something that I think we're all forever pushing towards and trying to make sure we do our best at. That's not a fear, but it's probably a concern that's more important than the fears.
A question just behind, and then you.
More on about how you work with communities and how you're worried about representing them. What kind of ethical frameworks do you have in place with working with people from communities?
The starting point is to encourage decision-making within those communities, to be honest and to talk to people. And as you can see, you know, there are cases, for example, the project with young Somali men, where every single decision about that piece was made by that original group of young Somali men. They appointed the director. I introduced them to 5 fantastic directors, but they chose which one they were going to work with. They decided with that director what the story was going to be. So because they come with the idea and it was rooted with them, it felt really, really important that every step of the way they still felt an ownership of those decisions. And with that piece as well, we shared budgets, etc., with them and with the wider community. We also, really importantly with that project, we perpetually talk to people about the longer term, because that community was really bruised from hit-and-run projects. And there was a lot of suspicion about anybody coming in to do another piece of work that would, you know, cover them in glory, and then they go away again. And there were lots of, particularly in the first project that we did actually, lots of quite complex moments with the community and conflicts within different sectors of the community that actually were all rooted back in that fact that in the past, the community had been let down by politicians, by regeneration people, and by arts people. So sticking with it is really important. Other projects, like the one with Mark, who didn't want to work with the community at all, actually he found his own way to do it, and it was a beautiful and delightful way to do it. But the contract with the community was much lighter in that case, and much more often about personal connections.
So,
I think it's a really interesting question, and I probably talk to for the whole session about that question. I think the key thing for us is that we always follow up, and we try to follow up right away and quickly, and that team, National Theatre Wales team, is crucial to that. The first thing, right during a show, we'll be encouraging people to join the team, and we'll have follow-ups right after a show, asking, sometimes it's a very small band of people that really want to do that follow-up, that are the sort of self-elected leaders, usually not the normal community leaders, usually people who've kind of found a voice through the project, but support any follow-up project. We have resources that we put towards little funds to help people do that work. So the key thing is in the follow-up and empowering people to make their own decisions and have their own say over what comes next. In terms of that longer-term evaluation and impact evaluation, we have done some of it, and with the project that we're doing with the Somali community, there'll be a more extensive version of that, and that partly comes because after we'd committed to doing the project, a funder got interested in it, and part of what that funder was interested in was that impact evaluation. However, we're really trying to do it in a way that still respects that contract with the community. It's about how do they want to be evaluated. Because I really resist the idea that somehow, because a piece of work is work with communities, it's got to have a social impact. I think we don't ask, as I was joking with someone before, we don't ask of the opera, does it have an impact on middle-class tax evasion? And I think that sometimes we're asking an equivalent question of communities. Now, that does not mean that lives aren't transformed. Lives are transformed. Some of the lives that are transformed are our lives. The artists going into this work. I also think that compact has to be equal on both sides. Can't expect someone to come into this work as a participant and say, oh, this could change the way that you think, change the way you think about yourself. If you're not ready to take that risk yourself by working with this person, maybe my life will change. Maybe I'll have to make a commitment to someone that I never planned to make, or maybe I'll just think about things differently. And I don't just mean on there wasn't a nice show way, I mean on a deep way. So we've all got to be ready to take those risks. We should acknowledge impact, but we shouldn't let it become in a way, a frame that overtakes the bottom line of this, which is that everybody has a right to express their creativity, everybody has a right to talk about their stories, their community, explore their questions, and that's what we certainly as a National Theatre should be encouraging.
Yeah.
When I hear you, I feel like I'm looking at controlled hyperactivity. Can you give us a place where something can happen from this, where people can communicate with each other?
On the most basic level, you are very welcome to our site. So I know it's National Theatre Wales and you're Australia, but as a holding mechanism, if you wanted to go on this evening and set up a group on our site, anybody could join that group and you can use that group. You can bookmark that page. You don't need to ever go near our front page. You bookmark that page. It's a really simple, it's Ning-based site, and through that group people can start a conversation. You can create your own blogs. People in Wales would love it if there was an activity of Australian artists. Some of the work that I heard about this morning in a site-specific workshop was magical, really fantastic. I would love to hear about what you're doing, and I'm really likely to hear it if it's on that site. And people in Wales would be really energized by you. So please feel very free to do that. But of course, I'm sure there are ways also through Arts Participation Incubator or just through things that you might want to set up yourself that could be part of that. But if you want to squat on our site, if you want to occupy National Theatre Wales, please do, and I'll be there with you.
I think it's an interesting, that there obviously is already international interest in what you're doing, and there is here in this room. And that, have you thought about how you might take the model that you're working with internationally, or what, 10 years down the track, is there a tour of the National Theatre of Wales, and what would it look like?
I mean, it's been a big question for us, and obviously it was one of the things that was very different for us from our glorious cousins, National Theatre Scotland, who, I think have made some of the most significant touring work of the last decade, notably Black Watch, but also amazing shows like Strange Undoing of Prudencia Hart, and obviously we were, partly because of the situation in Wales and these histories around site and the real involvement of people with place and land, went down a different route. We were both non-venue based theatres. They do site-specific work alongside the touring, and we do touring alongside the site-specific work. But there is a different feel, I think. And so on an international level, we haven't been as geared up early on to put work on the road. But also I think that's because we are really used now to these questions of what is it to be in a place? What is it to be here? What is it to be with this particular group of people? So when we were invited to make a show in Tokyo by the National Theatre there, that was an extraordinary moment for us, because in a way we were able to ask those questions in that place. It was a big question that we had at the site-specific workshop this morning, can site-specific work tour? And I think one person answered it really well in saying that if the core is the idea as opposed to the site, and that idea can respond to a variety of sites, then yes, it can move. So for example, in our work, I would say the Persians can never happen anywhere else. It can only happen in that army range up that hill. But maybe Coriolanus, which is actually about a sort of technological space where Shakespeare reinvents itself, could happen in any large space. So there is work there, Bradley, etc., that we're starting to talk to people about doing elsewhere. Bradley we're doing in Edinburgh this year, so it'll be on 7:30 in the evening, most nights in August. So if you want to log on something that's probably 4:30 in the morning in Australia, you can see the live version. But I think when we do go to other places, I would love us to be, doing meetings with people, doing things like the assembly, having groups that form online that really deepen that conversation and say, what did it really mean to be here, even if it was for a relatively short period of time? What did it mean to be here?
Fantastic. Any other questions? Yes?
I guess I'm very interested by the philosophy and practice of social inclusion and transparency that you've articulated through the launch that you've shown us this evening. That can develop just as the basis for this project, obviously, and this work. So I'm interested in, I guess, the development of your philosophy and incorporating those practices, and wondering if you can speak a little bit towards that in terms of perhaps there might be obvious challenges or things that might be.
It's another quite long talk along with the evaluation one. But in a very short nutshell, as Angarad mentioned, I've worked in a number of different companies and had formative experiences, particularly with companies like Mabu Mines in New York. But I think I really learned how to do what I was doing from the people that I met at Contact Theatre in Manchester and the teams I had there, and the very extraordinary board chair, a man called Wiley Longmore, who gave me that role there and gave me the other great offer of my life, really, alongside the National Theatre Wales one, which was saying that Contact had just been rebuilt, it had been closed, it was a venue in city centre Manchester, it had always had a brief for young people, but he said to me, we're reopening this building, we want you to put young people at the centre of everything that this organisation does. At the centre of everything. So that was the challenge that I had all along the way. And to do that, we worked with young people over 9 years in hundreds of different ways. If we were running workshops for young people, we'd then look at how can we train young people to deliver those workshops. If we were thinking about any organisational aspects of the theatre, we had groups of young people who would meet regularly to start taking decisions about what we would and wouldn't do. It started with really simple things. One of the first things that a group of young people said is,
We hate the fact that you've got numbers on the seats. We don't want to decide where we're going to sit in advance. The next day we took all the numbers off all the seats and changed the ticketing system. Young people saw that that had happened and they started to trust us. By the time I left, every appointment in that theatre was made by 2 panels of people that had equal say. A panel of staff and sometimes board members and a panel of young people. The staff couldn't appoint somebody unless the young people wanted to appoint them. We tried mixed panels, but young people preferred to have their own panel. They preferred their own line of questioning. So when my replacement was appointed, that person was appointed by a group of young people as much as by the board. So there were all sorts of elements around that. One of the most interesting, the project I was proudest of in the last year or so that I was there was called Future Fires, where we'd always done a lot of outreach. It was a very multicultural city, Manchester, lots of different populations trying to reach different people. It was a huge meeting place and melting pot, as Garrett pointed sometimes for international visitors as well. And when we do outreach, you know, we had a lot of young people trained as facilitators and workshop leaders who we get to run workshops for us, etc. But I think the boldest decision we ever made alongside the staff appointments was saying, actually, we're going to stop deciding, at least for a while, where we should do the outreach. We're going to ask the young people who they think they would like to outreach to. Who did they think we're not reaching, that they could help, we could support them in designing outreach programs. There's an extraordinary project called Future Fires that continued at Contact in different forms over a few years, where young people created their own programs to reach out to people that they felt we needed to be in touch with, and started to bring them into the building. So that's the kind of work and ethos that I was based around. Obviously, in this situation, it was transferring that out of a venue base and out of something as visibly clear, actually, as put young people at the heart of everything you do. And one of the things I love about the team video is that you see older people talking there alongside young people and making those networks happen. But that's been a step that you know, we've really had to think through. And questions around governance and decision-making, I'd still say probably we were, you know, it took 9 years at Contact, but we were further with at Contact than we are yet at National Theatre Wales, because I think the journey that you have to go on for people to really feel that they've got true decision-making power is exactly that. It's a journey. But that's where I, more than anything, learned from. And then the many people and companies, including international companies that visited, who had really good practice. So the companies like a company that I just visited in Auckland, not in Adelaide, called Massive Company. They've got a particular ethos. Companies in Brazil that I learned from. So we started pulling that knowledge into Contact and continue to try and draw on that at NTW.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've come, John, to the end of our allotted time. So I think a big round of applause for a really inspirational talk.